Noah explained to Susie how he resolved Tate's forced sleeping arrangement that one night at the Blue House. I knew that and made sure Tate understood it the next morning. I told him that if he ever forced himself on me or held me against my will in his room, our relationship was over for good. His arrested development, BPD, and emotional immaturity hinder him from easily understanding consent and respecting boundaries. He's much better now, and I won't let him push my boundaries anymore. Good for you, Noah, Susie touched my shoulder to comfort me. Even after 6 years with Noah and Tate, Susie, Jack, Anna, Andrew, and Bree had no idea who Tate truly was. He was an anomaly, a man whose inner world stayed hidden behind walls only he could navigate. Tate was an introvert who enjoyed parties, yet he guarded his thoughts obsessively, holding his cards so close no one could guess his feelings. After 20 years of knowing him, Noah had come to a startling realization. He didn't know Tate any better than he had the day they first met. Time had revealed Tate's habits, quirks, and routines, but never the man hidden beneath them. In many ways, Tate remained as unknowable as ever, a puzzle that refused to surrender its final pieces. Tate Blue didn't want to fuck Noah because Tate was the most fucked up boy in California. Noah just didn't know it yet. Tate wasn't just straight in the obvious sense of the word. He was born into wealth, and with that came rules, unspoken but absolute. Expectations, demands, requirements. People like him weren't free to love someone like Noah, not openly, not honestly. Boys like Noah weren't seen as equals in his world. We were conveniences, secrets, or scapegoats. Even if Noah was born into the right affluent family and had the proper pedigree, which would allow Tate's family to accept him as a suitor good enough to marry or fuck their son, Noah wouldn't be interested in him then, and Tate would be the last person in the world Noah would ever want to fuck. I didn't understand how any of that worked. I thought feelings were enough. Tate was only just beginning to understand the capitalistic machine he belonged to, and Noah was still naive enough to believe he could exist outside of it. They didn't just misunderstand each other, they didn't even have the tools to try. That was the real problem. A penniless trailer park kid standing in a world built for princes, thinking he'd somehow been invited in and was an equal to Tate. Noah thought that sitting at a table with wealthy men made him their equal. He mistook proximity for acceptance, a chair for belonging. What he didn't notice was the centerpiece of the table, the heavy cut of meat laid out under warm light. It had a place among them too. It was admired, discussed, and even valued, but it wasn't a guest, it was dinner. And that was the difference Noah couldn't see. In the Blue family, he was allowed closer than he ever thought possible, but never was he one of them. He wasn't protected by their world. He was consumed by it. Noah never stood a chance with Tate, nor did his feelings stand even the smallest chance of becoming a partnership or lasting love. Noah thought that when Tate's aunts and uncles, family friends, and grandmother wrapped him in hugs and kissed his cheek, it meant something permanent. As a child, he believed warmth was the same as belonging. He thought their kindness made him one of them, not just a guest, but family. What he didn't understand was that in families like Tate's, kindness could be casual, performative, extended without consequence. Real belonging, though, that was guarded, reserved, blood-bound. Anyone outside of it was something else entirely. Noah had no way of knowing. No one was going to explain it to him. In Tate's family, knowledge was power, and power was never handed to someone like Noah. To them, he was a convenience dressed up as charity, a boy with nothing, lucky enough to be allowed near their world, allowed to sit at the table, but never mistaken for someone who belonged at it. They spoke around him, not to him, smiled at him without seeing him. He was a passing presence, a temporary fixture they assumed would disappear as quietly as he had arrived, back to whatever small, forgettable place he came from. What surprised them wasn't who Noah was. It was that 10 years later he was still there, still sitting at the table, still waiting to be seen. The days after my mother died, I didn't feel real in any linear way. They arrived in fragments, phone calls that didn't sound like words, faces that blurred at the edges, and a quiet that followed me everywhere like a second shadow. People kept saying things like at least it was quick, or she didn't suffer, as if those sentences were meant to be comforting. They weren't. They just made the absence sharper, like something had been erased so cleanly it hurt to look at the space it used to fill. Tate didn't leave me alone. He couldn't. He sat with me in silence that first night, close enough that I could feel his warmth without him touching me, like he was afraid I might disappear if he let go of the room. I kept thinking about how strange it was that grief didn't care about timing or history. It just arrived and rearranged everything. And in the middle of it, my mind kept drifting backward, not forward. Back to when Tate and I were smaller versions of us, before everything had weight. I remembered his childhood in flashes. I didn't even realize I still carried it. Tate, as a boy with scraped knees and too much energy, running until he forgot why he was running, then collapsing beside me like I was the only thing that could anchor him. He used to talk like the world was something he had to conquer before it got to him first. Even then there was always that edge to him, protective, intense, impossibly loyal in a way that felt more like instinct than choice. When we were younger it didn't feel dangerous, it felt like belonging. There were afternoons when nothing mattered except the two of us existing in the same space. Lying on grass that smelled like summer, arguing about nothing, laughing until it hurt like the world couldn't touch us there. Tate would fall asleep mid-sentence sometimes, head turned toward me like I was part of whatever dream he was having. I think I learned early that love for him was never quiet. It was consuming, absolute, and I was always a little afraid of being left behind. But standing in the wreckage of everything now, my mother gone, my future suddenly hollow in a way I couldn't name, I started to understand that I couldn't survive on memory alone. Tate was still here, still close, still the closest thing I had to home. And yet something in me had begun to fracture in a different direction too. A smaller voice, quieter than grief but more persistent, asking what it would look like to exist outside of being held so tightly, to get my own apartment. To learn how to breathe without leaning on the intensity of us. Not to leave him, but to finally learn where I ended and he began. I grew up on the south side of Los Angeles in a trailer park that always felt like it was one storm away from falling apart. My childhood wasn't loud in the way people imagine hard lives to be. It was quiet, hollow, stretched thin between absence and neglect. My dad was gone before I could form a memory strong enough to hold him. My mom stayed, but only physically. She moved through life like she was half asleep, wrapped in television glow and alcohol, sinking deeper into herself until even the idea of care felt like something she didn't know how to reach for or provide. When I was very young, 4, maybe a little older, everything inside me already felt wrong in ways I didn't have words for. I struggled with eating, with sitting still, with the kind of calm other kids seem to be born with. Anxiety wasn't something I learned later, it was the atmosphere I grew up breathing. I remember preschool not as a place of joy or discovery, but as a place where I became aware for the first time that I was separate from everyone else. Watching other children exist so easily made me feel like I was missing something fundamental. My mother was a quiet woman when she was sober enough to be present, which wasn't often. She preferred the couch, the dim flicker of whatever show was on, the slow ritual of pouring herself away a little more each day. There was no dramatic cruelty, no sharp breaking points, just distance. The kind that doesn't announce itself until you realize you've been reaching for someone who never turned around. Looking back, it's strange how early you can recognize loneliness as a permanent condition. I didn't have language for it then, but I knew what it meant to wait for something that wasn't coming. A hand that wouldn't reach back, a voice that wouldn't answer when I called. I learned to exist quietly inside myself. Because anything else felt pointless. And then somehow everything changed without warning. I met Tate Blue like you meet a storm you don't yet understand that is going to rearrange your entire life. He was already someone by the time I noticed him. Loud in presence even when he wasn't speaking, sharp-edged, always half-smirking like the world had personally offended him. He was sarcastic, smug in a way that made other kids either hate him or orbit him without realizing why. Everyone else seemed to get the worst of him. I didn't. With me he was different in a way I didn't know how to name at first. Not softer exactly, Tate didn't do soft but attentive, like I wasn't something to be dismissed or used as entertainment. He never treated me like I was beneath him, never like I was fragile or strange. He didn't make me feel like I was a charity case, which was new, dangerous even in its own way. If I had known then what it would cost to be seen by someone like him, how deeply it would root itself into me, how it would follow me through every version of my life, I don't think I would have looked up at all. But I did, and that was the beginning of everything. I never told anyone I had mental health issues. It wasn't something that got spoken aloud in my life, it was something you learned to carry quietly like another organ you couldn't take out. You don't really escape it when you grow up in a house like mine. There's no clean separation between what's happening to you and what you become. My mother didn't talk to me the way other kids' parents talk to them. Most of the time she didn't talk at all unless it was to point out something I'd done wrong. A cabinet door slammed too hard. The refrigerator was not emptied when something spoiled. The trash was not taken out on the one day it was supposed to be done. Small things, always small things, but they stacked up until it felt like I could never exist correctly in the space she was in. What stayed with me more than anything wasn't even the yelling, it was the indifference that followed it. Like I was just another inconvenience moving through her house. Sometimes she would say things that stuck to me longer than I wanted them to, things about how she never should have had me, like I was something that happened to her instead of a person she was responsible for. I learned early that being seen didn't mean being cared for. Sometimes it meant being blamed. I had friends who lived in houses that felt like different worlds, families that ate dinner together, parents who asked questions that weren't accusations. I didn't know how to belong in that kind of structure, so I stopped trying to bring people into mine. It was easier to stay invisible than to explain what I couldn't even fully understand myself. Most days I tried not to go home. If I could stretch being anywhere else, school, outside, walking until it got dark, I did. Once a week felt like too much, but it was all I could get away with without raising more questions. Home wasn't a place I returned to, it was a place I survived in short, necessary intervals. And somewhere inside all of that, I still kept going to school, still kept existing like I was supposed to be normal. I just never told anyone how much effort it took to pretend I wasn't constantly holding myself together with whatever was left. The first time I went over to Tate's house, it felt like stepping into a different world entirely, like I'd accidentally crossed into a life I wasn't supposed to have access to. It was a 5-level mansion, the kind of place I had only ever seen in movies or on magazine covers, all clean lines and warm light and quiet luxury that didn't need to announce itself to be understood. I remember standing there for a moment too long at the entrance, just trying to make sense of it. It was beautiful in a way that didn't feel cold or untouchable though, more like something lived in. Victorian influences blended with modern design, wide staircases, tall windows that let the sun pour in as it belonged there, rooms that felt open instead of empty. I remember thinking, almost absurdly, that this house probably cost millions, 5, maybe more, and later I saw something about it in the trash during a second sleepover, like a casually discarded magazine clipping or listing that confirmed what I already couldn't fully process. But what struck me most wasn't the house itself. It was the way it felt to be inside it, warm, safe, welcoming in a way I didn't have a reference point for. People actually noticed me there, not in a suspicious or reluctant way, but in a simple, natural way that made me realize how invisible I had been everywhere else. In my own home, I could go hours without being spoken to unless I had done something wrong. At Tate's house, I was greeted as if I mattered just by existing in the room. His family was kind to me in a way that didn't feel performative. They asked me things like I had answers worth hearing. They included me in conversations like I wasn't an outsider who had accidentally wandered in. It confused me at first how easily they made space for me, how normal it seemed for them to do it. Tate's mom especially stood out. She was so warm it almost didn't feel real at first, like I was waiting for the moment it would turn. She wasn't older than 30, but she had this grounded, gentle presence that made the entire house feel softer just by moving through it. She would smile at me like I was already known to her, like I wasn't an inconvenience or a stranger. By the time I was around 5, I think I would have called her a second mom without even thinking about it. Because, to be honest, she was the closest thing I had to one. My real mother had become something else entirely in my life, present in name only, a kind of absence that still managed to take up space. But at Tate's house with Talia there and the warmth of everything around me, I didn't have to translate myself into something smaller just to be accepted. I just existed. And for a long time, that was enough to make me love it there without question. Talia always greeted me like I was already part of her life. She would open the door, pull me into a hug without hesitation, kiss my forehead and call me honey or dear in that soft, effortless way that made it sound like I'd always belonged there. I wasn't treated like a guest who needed to be carefully managed, I was treated like someone expected, like a second son. And over time, without me even noticing it happening, that started to reshape the way I understood what a home was supposed to feel like. By the time we were 8, 4 years after I met Tate, I had started to notice something I didn't fully know how to name. Suspicion, maybe, or confusion, because Talia didn't just treat me kindly. She favored me in a way that sometimes made me feel like I was standing slightly closer to her than Tate was, even when we were in the same room. It wasn't that she loved him less. It was just that I reacted differently to her warmth. I absorbed it. I didn't resist it. I didn't take it for granted. Tate, on the other hand, didn't seem to care about his mom. He didn't seem to care much when it came to adults in general. There was always this quiet contempt in him for authority, for structure, for anything that looked like it was trying to define him before he defined himself. It was like he viewed parents as a temporary inconvenience, something you endured until you could finally step into your own life and claim it fully. Wealth, expectations, inheritance. All of it felt like something he tolerated rather than respected. I could never fully figure out where that anger came from. It wasn't loud, not at first. It was just there, sitting under everything he did, like a current you only noticed when you tried to stand too close to him for too long. But with me, he was different. When we were 4, I remember being crammed into his bed during one of those early sleepovers, both of us half asleep, the room dark except for the thin spill of light from the hallway. Out of nowhere, he whispered something I didn't understand at the time in the way I understand it now. "Life would be joyless if you weren't here," Tate said, like it was just a fact he had figured out about the world. And I remember just blinking at him, confused, and saying, "Okay." Because my mom didn't really move for me, not in any meaningful way. If I went, I knew I'd be going alone. If I stayed because I had nowhere else that felt like it could hold me the same way he did. Tate and I were like that even then, strange, intertwined, already making decisions about each other that we didn't have language for yet. There was intensity in him that grew with every year, every birthday, every marker of time that made us more aware we weren't just kids anymore. It felt like he was always trying to secure something between us before the world had the chance to interfere. And I think, even at that age, I believed he loved me in the only way he knew how to love anything, completely, possessively, and like it was something he had to hold onto or risk losing himself. By the time we were 12, I told myself I would probably fade into the background of his life the way people do when adolescence starts rearranging everything. He was already starting to become someone people noticed without trying, confident, magnetic, the kind of presence that pulled attention into a room before he even spoke. It wasn't hard to imagine him becoming popular, surrounded by new people, new versions of himself. He was one of those people who moved through space like he already knew where he was going, like hesitation didn't exist for him. Charismatic isn't even a strong enough word for it. It was something sharper than that. Controlled, intentional, almost cinematic in the way he carried himself. The kind of person you couldn't help but watch even when you tried not to. And I won't lie, I envied it. Not just the attention he got, but the certainty he had in taking up space in the world. I was still trying to figure out how to exist without apologizing for it. He had never needed to learn that. But with me, he was still close, still intense, still acting like I was something important. Like I mattered in a way that didn't shift no matter how much everything else around him changed. And I think that's where the danger really started, because somewhere along the way I stopped being just his companion, and started being the one thing he seemed to believe he couldn't lose. When friends, family, or even strangers ask me about the rumors surrounding Tate and me, I never really know what to say. Because I don't have an answer, but because none of the answers are complete. What Tate thinks our relationship is and what I think it is don't fully align, and no matter whose perspective I try to speak from, it always comes out slightly wrong, like I'm translating something that refuses to stay in one language. I've been in love with Tate since I was 8 years old. At least that's when I first understood what the feeling was called, but sometimes I wonder how long it had actually been there before I had the vocabulary for it. Part of me suspects it started the moment I met him, or even the moment I stepped into his world and realized what I'd been missing. That warmth at home, that life that suddenly had color in it. And maybe it wasn't just his family or his house that pulled me in. Maybe it was him. He was, in the simplest terms, the most attractive boy I had ever seen. I hadn't been attracted to boys before, not that I had any real frame of reference at 4 years old, but something about him registered immediately. He was just beautiful, effortlessly so, like he had been assembled with intention. Tate really had hit the genetic jackpot. I loved the sharp line of his jaw, the way his freckles scattered across his cheeks as if they belonged there on purpose, the depth of his hazel eyes that always looked like they were holding something back. His hair was so dark it looked almost black in certain light, like night pressed into strands. It didn't curl, not exactly, but it had a soft wave to it that made it look untamed even when he tried to control it. I used to want to reach out and ruffle it just once or run my fingers through it the way people do when they're allowed to be close, but I didn't dare, not for a long time. Tate hated people touching his hair. He had boundaries like that, sharp and immediate, and everyone learned them quickly. Everyone except me eventually, because somewhere along the way he started letting me in. Small exceptions at first, brief allowances, moments that didn't belong to anyone else. And I clung to those moments more than I probably should have. It made me feel chosen. Like other people, I didn't have access to him the way I did. Like I had been given something rare, something fragile, something I could lose if I ever stopped being careful with it. And I think that's where everything started to blur between friendship, possession, love, and the quiet, consuming certainty that I was already too far in to ever step back out cleanly. The thing about Tate that very few people realize is that he's more than a complicated young man. Of course, most people could probably guess that just from looking at him. You don't really have to study him long before you understand there's more going on beneath the surface than what he shows. But even that version of him is only the beginning. What I didn't understand as a child, and what took me years to fully see, was just how many walls he had built around himself. Tate had emotional walls, barricades, and what felt like sealed-off bridges, paths that led somewhere real but were never meant to be crossed. He didn't let people in easily. Not peers, not teachers, not anyone. Even his mom, as warm and patient as she was, had moments where she struggled to reach him in the ways she wanted to. There were parts of him that stayed locked away, no matter how much love was offered toward them. I didn't recognize it for what it was back then. I just thought that was how Tate was, controlled, private, and selective about what he showed. But looking back, I can see it more clearly. He was a good actor in the ways that mattered most. He could mirror emotion when he needed to, reflect concern and interest or warmth in a way that made people feel like they were being seen, even when he was keeping himself hidden. He learned how to look like he cared about small things. Conversations, routines, and casual moments that made him seem present. But underneath it, I think the only thing that consistently pulled real weight for him was me. Not in an obvious or performative way, but in the way he oriented himself around my presence. If I were there, he would be engaged. If I wasn't, everything else seemed less important. He wasn't really interested in holidays unless I was part of them. He didn't care about traditions, celebrations, or the usual rhythms of family life in the way other people did. But if I were there, if I were sitting next to him, included in it, then suddenly it mattered. It became something worth showing up for. Over time, I stopped feeling like a guest in his life and started being a permanent fixture in it. Like I wasn't just visiting the house, I was part of it, like the staircase, the chandelier, and the dining room table, something that belonged there so naturally that no one thought to question it. No one ever asked if I was coming for dinner, no one ever wondered where I would sleep, because the answer was always the same, next to Tate. Snuggled in close, safe in the only place that had ever started to feel like mine as much as his. I've told people like Andrew, Susie, and even myself 100 different versions of why I stay with Tate, why I love him, and why no matter how much he hurts me, even when it isn't intentional, I can't seem to leave. It isn't just love in the simple sense, it isn't even just attachment, it's everything around him too. His family, his home, the life I grew up in by proximity. And yes, God help me, I understand how it looks from the outside when I say that I love the security of it all, the stability, the comfort of a world that doesn't feel like it could collapse at any moment. I won't pretend that part of it doesn't exist. But I never stayed because of money. I never stayed because of the lifestyle. I stayed because I didn't have anything else to go back to in my world. I came from nothing that felt safe enough to return to after Tate. My childhood wasn't a place, it was a gap. A missing structure where the family was supposed to be, so when I found Tate I didn't just find him. I found his family, his home, the rhythm of dinners and holidays, and doors that opened without hesitation. I found a version of belonging I had never been given anywhere else. If I left, I wouldn't just be leaving him, I would be losing all of it, and I never really had the option of pretending that didn't matter. Once I turned 22 and my mother died, that absence became even more absolute. No step-family, no distant relative I could call, no hidden safety net I had forgotten about. Just nothing, and Tate's world, however complicated it became, was still a world I understood how to survive in. A world where I had a place at the table, a room, a routine, a name that meant something inside it. There were only 2 times I ever came back after trying to step away. The first was after I moved out following my 18th birthday. I ended up house-sitting instead of living with the Blue family, and somewhere between the quiet of that house and the weight of everything I'd lost, I stayed longer than I planned. I told myself it was temporary, practical, simple, but the truth was I didn't just miss Tate, I missed Talia, Terrence, the structure of a home that had once felt like mine too. I missed the version of life where I didn't have to rebuild myself from scratch every morning. The second time was harder to explain, even to myself. It was after Tate slept with Tina at Brown. That should have been the line, the moment where everything finally snapped into place and I walked away like a person who knew how to protect himself. I didn't. I stayed longer than I should have. I told myself it was for clarity, for closure, for something that sounded rational enough to justify it. But the truth was messier. It wasn't just Tate I was staying for, it was the family, the home, the life I had built for myself without ever being formally invited but also never being asked to leave. And that's the part I've never fully said out loud. Because when you grow up without anything stable, you don't always recognize the difference between love and dependency until they've already become tangled together. Tate isn't a villain in my story, not in the way people like to simplify things. He's complicated, sometimes intensely so. He struggles with emotional regulation, with change, with anything that disrupts the internal structure he uses to feel safe in the world. There's a childlike quality to the way he clings to consistency, especially when it comes to me. Not because he wants to control everything in some calculated or harmful way, but because unpredictability feels like a collapse to him. Like if one thing shifts too far, everything else might fall apart with it. He doesn't build control to harm, he builds it to survive, and I understand that more than I should. That doesn't make everything easy. It doesn't erase the ways we've hurt each other or the moments I've questioned what I'm doing. But it explains why leaving isn't as simple as people assume it should be. Because leaving Tate has never just meant leaving a person. It's meant walking away from an entire world I only ever knew because he was in it. Tate never asked me why I stayed for so long or why I was so forgiving when I didn't always have to be. And I never asked him either, not in any real way that would have forced an answer. Some questions felt too dangerous to say out loud, like numbing them would make them real in a way neither of us could take back. And I think that's part of what makes everything between us so hard to define. After we turned 18, things shifted in a way neither of us really knew how to handle. We weren't kids anymore, but we also weren't fully separate. There were moments I said things to him I didn't mean, sharp, defensive things that came out wrong in the space between us. Things that were meant to create distance or test whether he would finally let me go. But he didn't respond the way I expected. He never fully broke, never fully left. If anything, he stayed, forgave it almost too easily. Like he understood something about me I hadn't admitted to myself yet, and I never really understood why. Most of the time I stayed for Tate in the simplest sense because I loved him, not just in one fixed way but in layers that changed over time. He was my childhood constant, my closest person, the one who had been there through every version of me that existed before I even knew who I was becoming. He was a brother in all the ways that mattered growing up, a mentor in the ways I learned how to navigate the world, a buddy, a roommate in everything but name. We filled every possible role two boys could fill without ever officially crossing the line into something that could be clearly labeled. Except that line was always there. Tate was adamant about it. He made it clear in ways both direct and indirect that anything beyond what we were wasn't something he wanted to explore. Not with me, not at all, really. And whatever his reasons were, beliefs, discomfort, identity, or something more complicated than I ever had access to, it created a silence around that part of me that never really went away. He could be sharp about it sometimes, not just firm but dismissive in a way that made it feel unsafe to even approach the subject. And over time, that made it impossible for me to come out to him in any honest way, not because I didn't know myself but because I didn't know what it would cost to say it to him directly, so I didn't. By the time I was 18, I had made a quiet decision to keep that part of my life separate, to never tell him, not because it stopped existing, but because I didn't think I could survive losing what we already had over something I couldn't fully explain to him in a way he'd understand. I tried to figure myself out in other places instead. There were moments I went on dates, small attempts at understanding attraction outside of him. On a cruise right before my mother died, I hooked up with guys I met there trying to feel something that would make my own emotions clearer. At Brown, I went on a handful of dates telling myself I was supposed to be exploring, supposed to be learning what I liked, who I could be outside of Tate. But nothing ever settled into place, not because I couldn't meet people, not because I didn't try, but because in every version of attraction I could recognize there was always one fixed point in the background of my mind that I couldn't move past. Tate was the only person I had ever felt anything for in that way, whatever that way even meant when I tried to define it. And maybe that's why everything else always felt slightly off balance, because he wasn't just my history. He was my reference point for everything I thought I understood about connection. And somehow, he was also the one person I could never fully tell the truth to. After I graduated from Brown, I went through a long stretch of my life trying to understand what was wrong with me. It wasn't constant, it never was. It was occasional, controlled in a way I didn't really have language for at the time. Maybe a handful of times a year I'd meet someone while traveling on cruises, in hotel rooms, in passing moments where connection was supposed to happen easily, naturally, the way it seemed to for other people. And most of the time, nothing happened inside me. No spark, no pull, no sense of wanting more, just neutrality. For years I thought that meant something was broken. It wasn't until much later, decades later really, that I learned there was a word for it. When I was in my late 30s, people began using the term demisexual to describe the idea that sexual attraction often depends on emotional closeness, trust, or deep familiarity. Hearing it for the first time felt like someone had finally put language to something I had spent my entire life trying to interpret incorrectly. But back when I was younger, late 80s, early 90s, there was no framework for that. Not in the circles I moved in, not in the small, fragile space where I knew a handful of gay men, maybe 3 people total who were even openly living that truth in any consistent way. Even then, their experiences didn't resemble mine. They didn't seem to require emotional grounding or a deep connection to pursue intimacy. It felt easier for them in a way I couldn't replicate no matter how hard I tried. That difference made me question myself more than I ever questioned the world around me. I didn't sleep with anyone until I was almost 20, and even then it wasn't something I understood in real time. It happened in fragments, moments tied to emotional instability, distance, or separation from Tate, like the time I was on a cruise after everything with him and Tina had happened, or the rare instances at Brown where I tried to step outside of my own life just to see if I could feel something different somewhere else. But nothing ever replaced what I already carried. Most of the time, I was too focused on school to even think about it in any meaningful way. I double majored in art and business, trying to build something structured out of the parts of myself that felt unstable. That's where I met people like Susie, Anna, Jack, Bree, and Andrew, even though Andrew wasn't an art major. He was interested in modern and impressionistic work from a psychological perspective, always observing and continually analyzing. Andrew had this quiet curiosity about people that made him feel less like a participant and more like someone studying the room he was standing in. He was studying psychology, and you could tell. There was a way he looked at people like he was already forming theories about them. Sometimes it was uncomfortable, sometimes it was oddly grounding. I remember asking him early on freshman year around 1986 about his background, his childhood, the things that shaped him. He didn't give me much, just that he'd been in foster care from age 7, that his original home hadn't been stable. He said it without detail, without invitation for follow-up, and I didn't push it. We hadn't known each other long enough for me to assume I had access to that kind of information. But Andrew always circled back to Tate. He was fascinated by him in a way that wasn't unusual for people who met Tate from the outside. Tate had that effect on people, especially in our social circles. There was something about him that drew attention even when he wasn't trying to. Andrew wanted to understand him the way he understood everyone else, through patterns, behavior, and underlying motivation. I didn't give him much to work with, not because I was hiding Tate, but because I didn't fully trust what would happen if I tried to explain him. Tate wasn't a simple subject. Anything I said about him risked flattening something that felt too complicated to translate into someone else's interpretation, so I kept it general, safe. Known facts, things people in Los Angeles already knew: that he was intense, socially unpredictable, sometimes volatile in the way he reacted to emotions, but not in a way that ever felt like calculated harm. More like overflow, like something inside him ran too hot and had nowhere else to go. Andrew would press sometimes, trying to get closer to something more precise. Because in our world, Tate was exactly the kind of person people wanted to analyze: beautiful, complicated, emotionally unreadable, impossible to categorize cleanly, especially for someone studying psychology. And I think even then I understood something I didn't have the language for yet. Everyone was trying to figure Tate out. But I was the only one who had ever lived close enough to feel what it meant not to have to. Not understanding my own sexual feelings or the way I existed in relation to other people, especially Tate, took me years to even begin to untangle. I didn't have a framework for what I was feeling. I just knew that what I experienced didn't match what I saw in other people. And when Tate didn't love me back in the same way I loved him, at least not in the way I needed to hear or understand, I didn't interpret it as complexity. I interpreted it as failure. Something in me must have been wrong. My family history only reinforced that belief. Growing up with a mother who was emotionally absent and often cruel, and a father who wasn't really present at all, shaped the way I understood love long before I ever had language for it. Affection wasn't consistent. Care wasn't something I could rely on. So I learned early that if someone didn't choose me, didn't reach for me, didn't stay close to me in the way I needed, it wasn't about circumstance, it was about worth. It became a pattern in my mind without me realizing it. If someone pulled away, I assumed I was the reason. If someone didn't love me back, I assumed I was unlovable. And with Tate, that belief became sharper because he did stay close in so many other ways. He was there, constant, woven into my life in a way no one else ever had been, but not always in the way I wanted romantically, or in the way I was just beginning to understand I might need. That mismatch didn't just confuse me, it hurt me, and I didn't have the emotional tools to separate "this person can't meet this need" from "I am the reason this need is not being met." So I turned it inward. I told myself I wasn't worth loving in that way. That if Tate didn't love me back romantically or fully or in the exact shape I had formed in my mind, then there must be something fundamentally unappealing about me that everyone else could see but I couldn't. That belief followed me into adulthood longer than I care to admit, even when I built friendships, even when I succeeded in school, even when people showed me kindness. There was always a quiet voice underneath it all: they're tolerating you, not choosing you. And Tate, being the most important person in my life, became the center of that distortion. Because if even he couldn't love me the way I loved him, then what did that say about me? It took a very long time to understand that his inability or unwillingness to meet me in a specific way was not a measurement of my worth. It was just two people deeply entangled, trying to exist inside feelings they didn't fully have names for at the time. But back then, I didn't know that. Back then, all I knew was how to turn absence into blame, and how to convince myself that being left out of someone's love meant I had done something to deserve it. When you don't grow up with anyone in your life affirming your worth, no steady reassurance, no consistent affection, nothing that tells you you matter just as you are, it leaves a kind of absence inside you that becomes hard to name. Not because you don't want to be loved, but because you start to internalize the idea that being loved isn't something you're entitled to in the first place. It feels conditional, like something you have to earn and constantly prove you deserve. Talia, Tate's mom, was one of the only people who ever disrupted that pattern for me. She was warm in a way that didn't feel strategic or cautious. She hugged me without hesitation, spoke to me gently, and treated me like I belonged in her home. In a lot of ways, she gave me something I didn't have anywhere else, the experience of being cared about without having to justify why. But even that came with complexity I didn't fully understand at the time. Because she was still connected to Tate, and Tate was still the center of my life in ways I didn't have the language to separate. I trusted her, but I was still careful about what I said, careful about what I allowed to be seen, careful about how easily things could be misunderstood in a world that loved turning closeness into something suspicious. And eventually, that's exactly what happened. Something private and entirely innocent was mentioned carelessly, just a passing comment with no awareness of how it would sound outside its original context. It wasn't meant to be anything. It wasn't even fully remembered by the person who said it, but it didn't stay contained. It was repeated, reshaped, and stripped of its original meaning until it became something else entirely. Within hours, it wasn't the truth anymore. It was a story people wanted to believe. And once it attached itself to my name, it didn't leave. By the time I was in school, I was already living under the weight of it. Other kids repeated it in ways that weren't always direct but were unmistakable. Teachers started using language I later understood were slurs, words meant to reduce and label and define me in a way that made me feel smaller than I already did. I didn't even have the language to defend myself properly. I just knew I was being marked as something I hadn't chosen and didn't understand how to explain away. And the truth is, I didn't present myself in a way that fit the expectations of the time either. I wasn't performing masculinity in the way people demanded it in the 70s and 80s. I wasn't aggressive, dominant, or correct in the narrow way boys were expected to be. So people filled in the gaps for me. They decided what I was before I had any chance to define it for myself. Even when I wasn't saying anything about who I was, people were already saying it for me. And in the middle of all of it, Tate remained this constant presence, close enough to feel like safety, complicated enough to never fully resolve what I meant inside his world. So I learned to stay quiet, not because I had nothing to say, but because I didn't yet believe I would be understood correctly if I did. Even though I trusted her and Tay, I could never risk them finding out the truth because they talk to each other and they're not known for having closed lips, which was an issue if I actually needed to talk to them about a sensitive topic. A few weeks before I left for college, my mother finally said it out loud. My secret that I never wanted anyone in Los Angeles to know. It happened in the kitchen in one of those strange, ordinary moments that never feel like they're about to become important until they already are. She spoke like she had been holding it in for a long time, like it had been sitting behind her teeth for years and only now found its way out. She said she knew what people were saying about me, not as a question, not as a concern, as a judgment she had already accepted. She told me that if those rumors ever became real in the way people would understand them, it would reflect on her, on the house, how she would be seen in town. There was no softness to it, only fear, embarrassment, and distance, as if I were something that could stain her life simply by being misunderstood. And then she turned it outward toward Tate in the direction of everything I had built my life around for years. She called it unnatural. She said it in a way that wasn't just about him, but about what she thought I was becoming when I was with him. Like proximity alone was enough to define me. I remember standing there, not even reacting the way I probably should have. Not because it didn't hurt, but because it felt like something I had already been carrying for so long that hearing it spoken aloud didn't change its shape. It just made it louder, and the worst part wasn't even the anger. It was the clarity, that in her mind I wasn't something to understand or protect or ask about. I was something to be ashamed of. And after that conversation, I didn't tell anyone what she said, not Tate, not anyone. I just carried it forward with me like everything else I had learned to carry alone. Because by then, I already understood the rule my life seemed to follow: some truths don't set you free, they just decide what you lose first. Once I started seeing how Tate treated gay people, and how casually some teachers and peers dismissed or mocked anything outside what they considered acceptable or heterosexual, I understood something important about the world I was living in while in school. On the Pacific Coast, at least in my circles, being open about who you were wasn't something you experimented with freely. It was something you calculated carefully or kept hidden entirely. So I learned silence early, not as a choice but as a strategy for survival. Meeting Mark disrupted that in a way I didn't expect. He was unlike anyone else in my life, older, steady, and unafraid in a way that didn't feel performative. Mark never tried to define me, question me, or squeeze me into categories I wasn't ready to understand. He treated me like a person before anything else. While everyone around me seemed to assume I was heterosexual simply because that was the default in their minds, Mark never assigned a label I hadn't chosen for myself. Instead, he asked, and when I didn't know the answer, he accepted that. He let the question remain unanswered without making me feel guilty, confused, or incomplete. There was no pressure to decide, no expectation that I owed anyone an explanation. He seemed to understand that some people discover themselves in an instant while others need years, and that neither path is more valid than the other. No one else in my life had ever given me that kind of freedom. They all seemed desperate to place me into a neat little box, to tell me who I was before I'd even had the chance to ask myself. It wasn't until I met my friends at Brown that I encountered other people who offered me that same grace and patience. That alone was disarming. To be seen as a human being before a label, to be allowed to exist without being explained, felt strangely unfamiliar and quietly life-changing. With him, I didn't have to monitor every word. I didn't have to guess what version of myself was safe to show. He became a kind of grounding presence, someone I could talk to without feeling like the conversation would be repeated, reshaped, or turned into something else later. In a life where trust was rare, that mattered more than I could explain. Tate saw Mark differently. That was immediate, instinctive, non-negotiable. Tate didn't like Mark's presence in my life, and he didn't pretend otherwise. It wasn't an argument he could be reasoned out of. It was a reaction rooted in something deeper, something protective and possessive, and deeply tied to how Tate understood closeness. If someone else had access to me in a way he couldn't control or predict, it unsettled him. I tried to explain that Mark wasn't taking anything away from him, that nothing between us changed what Tate and I were, but Tate didn't process it in those terms. When it came to my future, college, finances, independence, the tension between them sharpened. Mark represented possibility, structure, a path forward that didn't depend entirely on the world I had grown up in. Tate represented history, intensity, a bond that had defined almost every version of my life so far. And I stood between them, realizing something I didn't yet have the language for, that care could come in different forms, and not all of them were asking for the same version of me. And choosing between them wasn't really about love or loyalty. It was about what kind of life I was going to be allowed to grow into. There was never really a competition between Mark and Tate, not in my mind at least. They occupied completely different parts of my life, different categories of meaning. Mark was the kind of person everyone would describe as good for you, the kind of man parents would trust, the kind of friend who showed up consistently, who listened without judgment, who didn't twist your words into something else later. He was steady in a way that felt almost foreign to me, kind, informed, patient, and grounded. If life had been simpler, he would have been the obvious direction my future should have taken in my early 20s. And then there was Tate. The problem was that I didn't fall in love with the obvious choice. I fell in love with the boy who had been in my life since I was a child, the one who was unpredictable, intense, frustrating, and completely imprinted into my sense of home. The one who could be brilliant and cold in the same breath, who moved through the world like he was always bracing for impact, even when nothing was happening. Sometimes I would joke with Mark about it, trying to make sense of something that never really made sense, even when I said it out loud. I'd tell him I had managed to fall for the most emotionally unavailable person in Lowe's Angels, the kind of person who didn't fit into any of the labels people tried to assign him. And Mark would laugh because he understood the absurdity of it in a way I couldn't escape. Those drives home, many small moments after milkshakes or long conversations where everything felt temporarily lighter, became the only space where I could say the truth without it turning into something heavier than I could carry. I would talk about Tate the way you talk about something you love and don't fully understand, half fondness, half exhaustion, all attachment. And Mark would just listen, not trying to fix it, not trying to compete with it, just listening like he understood that some connections aren't logical, they're just persistent, and maybe that was the part that confused me the most. Because I knew exactly what kind of life I should have wanted. But I also knew exactly which one I kept choosing anyway. What were the odds that the only gay person I knew on any kind of intimate, honest terms until I was well into adulthood would be a man I met by chance, someone older, someone already shaped by his own history, someone who had already lived through a version of the same kind of pain I was only beginning to understand. Mark had already gone through something like it years before I ever named it for myself. The experience of loving someone who didn't love him back, of trying to make sense of an attachment that didn't resolve cleanly, of learning how to live with feelings that didn't get answered the way you hoped they would. When I talked to him about Tate, Mark didn't look at me like I was strange or dramatic. He just understood. Not because our situations were identical, but because there was a shared emotional language there that didn't need explanation. That was rare for me. If I had to choose between the friends I made at university and Mark, I think I would have chosen Mark every time. Not because the others weren't important. Susie, Anna, Bree, Andrew, and Jack, they were all significant and wonderful in their own ways, each one offering something different. but Mark occupied a different category entirely. He wasn't just a friend in passing or a peer in a shared environment. He felt like a refuge from confusion, from isolation, from the constant effort of trying to translate myself into something other people could understand. And maybe part of that was simply because he was queer too. There's a kind of recognition that happens between people who have had to navigate identity in a world that doesn't always make space for it. A shorthand that doesn't need to be spoken out loud. I loved my straight friends, I did. And I also loved Talia in a way that felt natural and uncomplicated, even though she existed in a world I was never fully part of. But with Mark there was something else. A sense of being understood without having to justify the shape of your feelings first. Talia, Tate's mother, was still one of the only people I could say I genuinely loved in that same way. She was kind to me in a way that never felt conditional, never felt like she was waiting for me to become something more acceptable before she allowed it. I never fully understood why Tate reacted so differently to her sometimes, why the subject of his mother brought out such complicated responses in him. Maybe some things require being inside a family to fully understand from the inside out. But I knew what she meant to me. She felt like one of the only places I had ever been allowed to exist without explanation. And Mark felt like another. He was older, yes, but not in a way that felt like distance, more like perspective. He had life experience I didn't have yet, and he never used that to position himself above me. He just listened, talked, laughed at the right moments, made space for me to be confused without making me feel broken for it. Most people my age didn't know what to do with me back then. I didn't fit neatly into the expectations they had for boys, masculinity, or identity. Teachers labeled me in ways that followed me longer than I understood at the time. I liked art. I didn't care about the things other boys were supposed to care about. I didn't know how to perform what was expected of me, and I didn't always want to try. Later in life, Tate would say things about how he saw me, how I fit into his world, how he understood me in ways I didn't fully recognize at the time. And some of those things stuck with me in ways I still don't fully know how to unpack. Because in the middle of all of it, there were still three constants I couldn't separate from my sense of self. Tate, who was my history, Mark, who was my refuge, and everyone else who existed somewhere in between was important but never quite touched the deepest parts of me the way the first two did. I had known Mark for about 6 months before I finally told him about my mental health. At the time, I was already on medication, Prozac, what I called leveling things out, because that was the simplest way to describe it. It didn't feel like healing so much as flattening. My emotions stopped spiking the way they used to, but they also stopped rising in meaningful ways. Everything became even, muted, distant. Looking back, I think that emotional blunting is part of why my 20s looked the way they did, why relationships never quite formed, why I could be present but never fully in anything. When I finally talked to Mark about it, it didn't come out as a dramatic confession. It came out in pieces. My family, the absence of stability. The way I'd grown up was without anything that felt emotionally safe or consistent. I told him it felt like a failure on every level, like I had been built in an environment that never actually supported a functioning version of me. And Mark understood more than I expected him to. Not because his life was the same, but because he had his own version of constraint. His parents lived in Boston, wealthy, traditional, socially established people who valued appearances and expectations in a way that left very little room for deviation. They weren't cruel in the obvious sense. They were the kind of people who believed they were doing what was right. Catholic, structured, and deeply tied to tradition. But there was an unspoken rule in their world. Certain truths came with consequences, and some identities would quietly disqualify you from the life you were expected to inherit. Mark lived with that awareness constantly. He told me once, very plainly, that he didn't expect his family to accept him fully if they knew everything about him. Not because they didn't love him in their way, but because love in that context had conditions he couldn't fully control. He had relationships here and there over the years, nothing simple or permanent. At one point he was with someone named Chris who was older, more experienced, someone who had functioned as a kind of guide in his life. When that ended, Mark didn't really replace it with anything stable. He just kept moving: work, travel, distance, or routine. Work became his structure. It gave him purpose, mobility, and enough separation from everything personal that he didn't have to sit in uncertainty for too long. And then there was I. Somehow I stayed one of the few constants in his orbit, even as everything else in his life stayed in motion. He would be gone for months at a time, traveling for work, different cities, different obligations, a life that was never fully anchored in one place. But when he came back to Los Angeles, he would call as if no time had passed at all. Dinner, a movie, a walk, whatever made sense that night. And I learned something important about those calls. Because every time Mark was in town, Tate felt it, not in a rational way, not something he could explain or justify, but in a way that was immediate and physical in the space between us. The atmosphere in the dorm would shift, his mood would tighten, his patience would shorten in ways that didn't always have a clear cause. It wasn't about jealousy in any simple sense. It was something more instinctive than that, like disruption, like the presence of another fixed point in my life destabilized something Tate relied on more than he ever admitted, and even after Mark left, it didn't stop right away. It usually took a couple of days, sometimes up to 72 hours before things settled again. Before Tate stopped packing, stopped reacting, stopped carrying that edge in his voice that didn't belong to any specific argument. I noticed it, I just didn't always know what to do with it, because in my mind, Mark wasn't a threat to anything. He was just one of the only places I had ever gone where I didn't feel like I had to disappear in order to be understood. Ever since Noah was a small boy, there had been something about him that people couldn't resist. It started with the obvious things, the soft, yellow-blonde hair that always seemed to catch the light, the wide blue eyes, the small button nose, the slightly protruding ears that only made him more endearing instead of less. He looked like something carefully designed to be loved. In preschool, mothers would linger a little too long when dropping off their own children, crouching down to his level, smiling at him as if he were theirs. Some of them joked, half-joked, that they wished they could take him home. They cooed over him, tapped his nose, brushed invisible lint from his shoulders just for an excuse to touch him. Noah accepted it all quietly, blinking up at them, shy but compliant, as if he understood that being adored was simply something expected of him. And somehow he never grew out of it. The quality didn't fade with age, it sharpened. As he got older, the softness didn't disappear, it settled into something more defined, more striking, without losing what made people feel safe around him. By the time he was a teenager, the attention had shifted but never lessened. Mothers still noticed him first. They watched him the way they evaluated boys who came too close to their daughters, but with Noah there was no tension, no suspicion. He passed every silent test without trying. He looked like the kind of boy who wouldn't cause trouble, the kind who wouldn't push boundaries or leave consequences behind, the kind you didn't have to worry about. Girls noticed him too, just as quickly. In classrooms, their attention drifted toward him without effort. A foot nudges his under the desk, light and testing. A glance held a second longer than necessary. Quiet attempts to pull him into something more, something just beyond the innocent image he carried so naturally. Noah never leaned into it, but he never rejected it harshly either. He existed in that space, approachable, gentle, just distant enough to remain safe. He was the ideal, the kind of boy a girl could bring home without rehearsing explanations. The kind of boy who wouldn't make a mother nervous, who wouldn't set off alarms or force difficult conversations. There was no fear attached to Noah, no sense that he would take too much, go too far, or leave something broken behind. He was mannerly, polite, kind in a way that didn't feel performative. He didn't take up space the way other boys did, didn't leave messes, didn't demand more than what was offered, didn't overstep. He moved through other people's homes like he was aware he was a guest, even when he'd been invited to stay, and maybe that was part of it too. Noah knew how to be wanted, he knew how to make himself easy to keep. As he grew older, the attention he drew didn't disappear, it changed, sharpened, and took on a different weight. By 18, there was no ambiguity. Noah was no longer a child. The softness that once made people hover now sat beside something undeniably adult. He still had blonde hair, blue eyes, and the same approachable face. But now he was not just cute, he was striking and disarming. His presence drew attention without asking. In the context of the 1970s and 1980s, that look carried a specific meaning, especially within emerging gay subcultures. Young men like Noah, slender, blonde, not heavily built, with a mix of softness and masculinity, were often idealized. The term twink would later become more widely recognized, describing that exact aesthetic, youthful, slight, and quietly magnetic, without the overt dominance associated with more traditionally alpha presentations of masculinity. Noah fit that image almost too perfectly. He wasn't imposing. He didn't carry himself with aggression or bravado, but he didn't need to. There was something about him that made people look twice, that made conversations stall when he entered a room. Men noticed him. Women noticed him. Even people who didn't fully understand why they were drawn to him still felt it. And Noah, as always, moved through it carefully. He didn't exploit the attention, but he couldn't avoid it either. It followed him into classrooms, into hallways, into every shared space. People watched him in ways that felt heavier now, more intentional. Compliments lingered longer, looks meant more. Some of that attention crossed lines it shouldn't have, especially from adults who should have known better. Being labeled or spoken about in inappropriate ways, even indirectly, wasn't something Noah invited, but it was something he had to navigate all the same. It added a layer of discomfort to something that had once felt harmless. Still, Noah held onto the same qualities that had always defined him. He remained polite, careful, measured, but at 18 there was a growing awareness beneath it all, an understanding that the way people saw him wasn't always simple and wasn't always safe. That being the center of attention didn't mean being understood, it just meant being seen. Noah had always been marked by the details people notice first. It was his hair above all else, blonde, soft, almost silky in certain light, the kind of texture that invited attention without effort. People reached for it instinctively. Teachers brushed it aside while speaking to him. Girls toyed with it absent-mindedly in passing. Even strangers seemed to forget themselves around it, fingers lifting as if drawn by something harmless and familiar. Tate was no different. He touched it constantly, without thinking, without restraint, as if it was part of their shared rhythm. A habit formed so early that it had become second nature. Sometimes it was a light tug to get Noah's attention, sometimes just his hand resting there while they sat in silence, fingers threaded through those soft strands as if grounding himself. It happened so often that neither of them questioned it anymore. Noah didn't seem to mind. Not when it was gentle, not when it was familiar. When they were younger, other kids did it too, bullies pulling too hard, girls stroking it in passing, teachers absent-mindedly smoothing it down. Noah tolerated most of it with quiet patience. He only pulled away when it crossed a line, when the grip became rough, when it stopped being casual and started becoming something that felt like taking instead of touching. That was the difference for him. His hands were small, his features delicate in a way people always commented on without thinking. Even his eyelashes were pale blonde, almost invisible until he blinked in the light. His blue eyes changed with his mood, bright and open when he was happy, heavier and darker when something weighed on him. And more often than either of them admitted, Noah's mood seemed tied to proximity. When Tate was near, something in him softened. When Tate wasn't, that light dimmed. It created a strange kind of symmetry between them. They were visually almost opposites, Tate with darker hair, heavier presence, sharper edges that made him stand out in a different way. Noah was light where Tate was dark, soft where Tate was rigid. Together they looked less like a coincidence and more like a contrast designed to fit. Like two pieces of a puzzle no one else could quite understand. But what people often mistook for control in Noah wasn't control at all. He didn't use his appearance deliberately. He didn't calculate the way others reacted to him or weaponize softness or charm. He wasn't consciously aware of the effect he had, the way a certain look, a certain tilt of his head, a quiet, almost vulnerable expression could change the entire direction of a room. If anything, Noah was naive about it. Unaware that his Bambi eyes, as people sometimes joked, could make others soften instantly. Unaware that a slight downturn of his mouth could shift someone's behavior entirely. He didn't realize how easily people bent toward him, how often they gave him what he wanted without him ever asking directly. Noah had no idea how much power his wide, Bambi-like blue eyes, gentle smile, and irresistibly sweet face held over the people who cared about him. He never seemed to realize that the moment he looked frightened, upset, or overwhelmed, most people instinctively wanted to protect him. No one was more susceptible than Tate. All it took was one anxious glance from Noah, those impossibly innocent Bambi eyes searching for reassurance, and Tate's protective instincts would take over without hesitation. Whether it was a school bully, a threatening stray animal, or any obstacle standing in Noah's way, Tate was already moving before he'd had time to think. If Noah had asked for the moon, Tate would have started looking for a ladder. The truth was that Tate had been hopelessly wrapped around Noah's little finger for years. It wasn't because Noah manipulated him, far from it. Noah remained blissfully unaware of the effect he had. It was simply that Tate found it nearly impossible to deny Noah anything when those pleading eyes met his own. Only a few years after meeting the shy blonde did Tate finally realize the uncomfortable truth. Somewhere along the way, without ever intending it, Noah had become the one person who could effortlessly melt his resolve. Tate included. And over time, without either of them nomming it, that became part of their dynamic too, Tate's steadiness, Noah's softness, and the quiet gravity that kept pulling them back into each other's orbit even when everything else around them changed. Noah was the kind of boy people noticed before they understood why. Pale skin, soft blonde hair, a face that leaned gentle rather than sharp. He carried an almost effortless softness with him. Not fragile exactly, but approachable in a way that made people relax around him without thinking. Even as he got older, there was still something unguarded in the way he moved through the world, like he hadn't learned yet to build walls around himself. What he liked reflected that same softness. He gravitated toward art more than competition, films more than games, quiet things over loud ones, comfort objects, small rituals, familiar spaces. Plush toys were a constant thread in his life. Every Christmas, without fail, another one found its way to him. It became almost a tradition, one that even Tate participated in without ever nomming it as such. Tate bought him plushies often, not as a statement, not as something he would have described as sentimental, but as if it simply made sense. And somehow those soft objects didn't stay separate. They ended up scattered between their spaces, especially in Tate's room where they accumulated quietly over time. No one ever formally decided they were Noah's, but they were treated that way anyway. It was the closest thing Tate ever did to openly acknowledging softness. To Tate, Noah wasn't something fragile or distant. He was something familiar, something he could tolerate in a world where most things felt sharp and untrustworthy. And over time, that familiarity turned into something more instinctive, protective, habitual, difficult to separate from his daily life. Noah didn't seem to need much beyond proximity. Being near Tate was enough to settle him. Sitting in the same room, falling asleep in the same space, existing without pressure to explain anything, that was where Noah seemed most at ease. It wasn't something he ever asked for outright, but it was something he returned to again and again. People around them noticed Noah easily. He had that kind of presence, soft-spoken, visually striking in a gentle way, the sort of boy who made parents instinctively approve and peers instinctively pay attention. He was often seen as the safe kind of attractive, polite kind unlikely to cause trouble, the kind of boy someone could bring home without fear of judgment or consequences. But what people saw on the surface didn't capture the full picture of him. Noah wasn't defined by others' expectations, even if he sometimes moved through them without resistance. There was intelligence behind his quietness, a future that wasn't fully shaped yet but clearly pointed toward something larger, scholarships, opportunities, a path that could take him far from where he started. The lack of money in his present didn't define his potential, it only marked it as temporary. Tate saw that too in his own way, even if he didn't say it. Tate was often perceived as cold, distant, controlled, and difficult to read. He didn't offer warmth easily, and most people never expected him to. That was simply how he existed in the world. But Noah was different. With Noah, something shifted, subtly, inconsistently, but noticeably enough that it mattered. The edges of Tate's presence softened in ways no one else seemed to provoke. Not entirely, not permanently, but enough that there was a pattern to it. Enough that Noah became, unintentionally, the one place where Tate's coldness wasn't absolute. And in that imbalance, Noah's softness, Tate's restraint, something unspoken formed between them, not defined, not labeled, but persistent. A connection neither of them fully understood, but both of them kept returning to anyway. Even at 4 years old, Tate always took care of Noah, especially when Noah stayed the night at the Blue House. Noah was still sitting stiffly on the edge of the mattress, like he hadn't fully accepted that it was allowed. Tate noticed. He leaned back on one hand, studying him for a second, then spoke again, more direct this time. "You're sleeping here," Tate said. Noah glanced over. "I already sat down." "That's not what I mean." Tate shifted closer, bumping his shoulder lightly into Noah's like he was physically trying to anchor him in place. "I mean, you're actually sleeping here, not sitting here until you decide the floor is better." Noah let out a small breath. "I wasn't going back to the floor." Tate gave him a look that clearly said he didn't believe that for a second. "You were thinking about it," Tate said. Noah didn't answer, which was answer enough. Tate sighed, then turned slightly so he was facing him more fully. "Look, I don't care how expensive anything is in this room. I don't care what you think you're allowed to use." He tapped the mattress once for emphasis. "This is a bed, you sleep in it." Noah's fingers curled into the fabric nervously. "It's your bed. And I'm telling you, you can use it," Tate replied immediately. Then, softer but firmer, "I want you to." That made Noah look up. Tate didn't look away this time. "You're not going to make sense of it if you keep trying to decide what you're supposed to do," Tate added. "Just listen to me for once." Noah hesitated. "You really want me to sleep here?" Tate nodded without a second thought. "Yes." A pause. Then he added, like it should be obvious, "And I'm not taking no as an answer tonight." Noah exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders loosening just a little. "You're weirds," Noah muttered. Tate's mouth twitched. "Yeah, get used to it." Then he nudged the blanket toward him. "Now lie down before I decide you're doing that wrong too." Tate didn't really treat it like a suggestion anymore. After that first sleepover, it became something unspoken but firm between them, like a rule that didn't need to be argued twice. Tate liked Noah there, on his bed, in his space. sleeping where he could see him, know he was there, know he hadn't disappeared into the quiet of the house. And Noah, for all his hesitation, had slowly started to accept it. Tate shifted first, patting the mattress like he was assigning positions. "You're on the right side," he said simply. Noah paused as he started to lie down. "Is there a reason for that?" Tate nodded once like it was obvious. "Yeah, it's the best side." "That's not a reason," Noah muttered. "It is to me," Tate replied, already pulling the blanket up. Noah hesitated for another second, then carefully settled into the right side of the bed. It was noticeably more comfortable, softer, better supported, like it had been used more often and had naturally become the preferred spot. He shifted onto his side, facing the wall on the right, curling slightly into himself out of habit. Tate watched him for a moment, then moved in behind him without much ceremony. Noah tensed slightly. "Tate." "Relax," Tate said quietly. Then Tate slid in close, spooning him from behind like it was the most natural thing in the world. One arm settled around Noah's middle, steady and warm, anchoring him in place without pressure. Noah blinked in the dark. "You always do that?" he asked softly. "Do what?" Tate murmured, already adjusting the blanket over both of them. "This." Tate shrugged faintly against his back. "Yeah." Noah was quiet for a moment. "Why?" There was a pause before Tate answered, voice lower now. "Because you're cold," he said simply, "and you don't stay still when you sleep." Noah let out a small breath, like he didn't quite know what to do with that answer. Tate tightened his hold just slightly, not restrictive, just steady, like he was making sure Noah stayed where he could feel him. "Go to sleep," Tate added. Noah hesitated, then relaxed a little into the mattress, into the warmth behind him. "Okay," he said finally. And for once, the room didn't feel cold at all. Tate's arm tightened around him again, as he could physically trap warmth out of Noah if he held on hard enough. Noah shifted slightly under the blanket. "You're doing it again." "I'm not doing anything," Tate muttered immediately. "You're literally shaking me." Tate went quiet for half a second, then stubbornly said, "That's the bed moving." Noah let out a tired breath. "It's not the bed." Tate clicked his teeth together once, then sighed like he was annoyed at his own body. "It's not even cold." Noah tilted his head back just enough to look at him over his shoulder. "Tate, your hands are freezing." Tate hesitated. "They're fine. They feel like you just grabbed ice." That earned a pause. Tate's grip loosened slightly, like he was suddenly self-aware in a way he didn't like. "I run cold," he said finally, quieter now, almost defensive. Noah hummed, "You run frozen, that's different." Tate's ears went faintly pink in the dim light. "You're exaggerating." "I'm not." A beat passed. Then Noah added, softer but pointed, "You're literally clinging to me like I'm a space heater." Tate shifted closer immediately, as if that confirmed the accusation. "I'm not clinging." Noah sighed again. "You are." Tate frowned against his shoulder. "I just can't regulate it." Noah blinked. "Your body temperature." "Yes." There was a short silence, then Noah snorted quietly. "That might be the most dramatic thing about you." Tate's response came muffled, embarrassed. "Shut up." Noah smiled a little into the pillow. "You're shivering in September, Tate." "I said shut up." Noah adjusted slightly, settling back into him anyway, like it didn't actually bother him. "It's okay, just stop denying it." Tate hesitated, then, very reluctantly, mumbled, "You're warm." Noah's expression softened. "Yeah, I know." Tate pulled him in again, quieter now. "Don't move." "I wasn't going to." A pause. Then Noah, half asleep already, "You're still cold though." Tate sighed but didn't argue this time. "I know." Tate wouldn't allow even a centimeter of space between his and Noah's bodies at night, like distance itself was something he couldn't tolerate once the lights went out. The duvet covered them both, heavy and warm, but Tate still trembled underneath it, small involuntary shakes that rippled through the mattress like he was frozen from the inside out rather than the room around him. Even when he tried to settle, his body never fully did. Sleep was always a fight for him, especially on nights when his seizures left him exhausted but wired at the same time, like his brain refused to power down properly, no matter how still he tried to be. Noah felt the bed shift again and turned his head slightly. "Hey, you're shaking more than usual." Tate exhaled sharply, frustrated. "I'm fine." "You're not fine," Noah said gently. You're literally vibrating the mattress. Tate clenched his jaw. It's just, my body doesn't shut off. Noah paused at that, his voice softening. Is it the seizures again? Tate hesitated for a moment too long. Yeah. Noah shifted a little closer without thinking. Did you take what you're supposed to take? Tate gave a small, annoyed grunt. Yes, obviously. Okay, Noah said, calmer now, then stop acting like you have to fight the bed too. Tate let out a short, humorless laugh. It feels like it. Noah adjusted the blanket higher over both of them. You don't have to hold on to me like I'm going to disappear. Tate tightened his hold anyway, just slightly. I'm not holding on to you. Noah glanced back at him. Tate. A beat. Fine, Tate muttered. I am. Noah's tone softened. You can just sleep, I'm not going anywhere. Tate didn't answer right away. The shaking didn't stop, but it slowed a little as he pressed closer, forehead nearly against Noah's shoulder. Stay, he said quietly. Noah nodded once in the dark. I'm here. And for a moment, Tate stopped fighting the night as much, just enough to breathe through it beside him. Tate shifted again and finally settled with his head resting against Noah's chest over the fabric of his shirt. The sound and rise of Noah's breathing gave him something solid to focus on while his own body kept misfiring. His hand curled lightly into the shirt near Noah's chest, not gripping tightly, just anchoring himself so he didn't feel like he was drifting. Noah didn't move away, he just stayed steady, breathing slowly and even. You're okay, he murmured, it'll pass. And little by little the shaking didn't vanish completely, but it eased, softening into something more manageable as Tate let Noah's warmth and presence do what his own body couldn't. Every year their closeness only seemed to increase, especially after Tate turned 15. What started as casual comfort turned into something constant. Tate insisting Noah sit on his lap for hours while they read comics, played video games, or watched movies, like it was simply the most efficient way to exist. Tate didn't really believe in personal space, at least not when it came to Noah, and they often ended up so close it felt like they were sharing the same air. Noah's cheek would rest against Tate's shoulder or chest without either of them thinking much of it anymore. It had become their normal. One evening, they were like that again in the basement. Noah settled comfortably on Tate's lap, both of them focused on the screen, completely unbothered by how tangled together they were. Tate's cheek was against Noah's, their breath close and uneven. The door creaked open, and Uncle Joey and Uncle Tim stepped into the room. Joey took one look at them, basically attached cheek to cheek, and froze for a second. Then he grimaced, seriously, get a room. Uncle Tim grimaced, then laughed before he went back upstairs. Without waiting for a response, Joey turned and walked right back out, shaking his head as he left. Tate didn't even look away from the game. He's dramatic, he said flatly. Noah sighed, we're very close together. Tate adjusted his arms slightly, pulling Noah in just a bit closer like it was a reflex. Yeah, so. Noah glanced at him, you really don't think this is weird? Tate finally looked down, expression calm. No. A beat passed. Noah muttered, that explains a lot about you. And just like that, Tate went right back to the screen like nothing about it was unusual at all. The closeness between Tate and Noah eventually made them an easy target at school. People started noticing how inseparable they were, and it didn't take long before it turned into teasing, then bullying. Shoves in hallways, lockers slammed shut a little too close, whispers that followed Noah around even when Tate wasn't nearby. Noah tried to brush it off, but it started to wear on him. One afternoon, it escalated when a group cornered Noah near the lockers, laughing as one of them shoved him hard enough to stagger back. Where's your shadow now? One of the boys mocked. Before Noah could respond, Tate appeared. He didn't rush, he didn't look surprised, he just walked straight in, expression flat in a way that immediately changed the air. Move, Tate said simply. The boy who shoved Noah scoffed, or what? Tate stepped closer, or you'll regret it. The boy laughed, you're not scary. Tate tilted his head slightly, I don't need to be. The tension snapped as the bully shoved Tate's shoulder, back off. Tate didn't stumble, he just looked at the hand like it was inconvenient. Then he looked up, don't touch him again. The bully smirked, or you'll what, tell your boyfriend. Tate's expression hardened slightly, say it again. Noah stepped forward quickly, Tate don't. But Tate didn't look away from the bully. Say it again, he repeated, quieter this time. The hallway had gone still. The bully hesitated, then scoffed and took a step back. Whatever, you're both weird. He turned and walked off with the others, the tension slowly breaking as they disappeared down the hall. Noah exhaled shakily, "You didn't have to do that." Tate glanced at him, "Yes, I did." Noah frowned, "It's going to make it worse." Tate shrugged slightly, "Let it." Noah looked up at him, "Tate." Tate's voice softened just a little, "I'm not letting them touch you." And for once, there wasn't any joking in it at all. It started smaller than before, things Noah could almost convince himself were accidents. A shoulder bump in the hallway that sent him off balance, a backpack was knocked out of his hands in class, laughter that followed him longer than it should have. Then it stopped feeling accidental. One afternoon, Noah was walking past the courtyard when a group cut across his path. "Hey," one of them said too casually. Noah tried to step around them, "Move." They didn't, instead one of them shoved him lightly at first, testing. Noah stumbled back, "Seriously, what is your problem?" That earned a few laughs. "Relax," another said, "we just want to talk." Noah's jaw tightened, "No you don't." The first boy stepped closer again, "You think you're better than everyone just because you hang around Tate." Noah's expression shifted, "I don't think that." "Then why are you always glued to him?" the boy snapped. Noah went quiet for a second, "That's not your business." That seemed to be the wrong answer, the shove came harder this time. "Answer the question," the boy said. Noah staggered, catching himself, his voice sharpened, "Don't touch me." A beat, then another shove, closer to the wall this time. "Or what?" the boy mocked. Noah's hands curled into fists but he didn't swing. "Stop." The laughter around him grew louder. "Where's your boyfriend now?" someone muttered. Noah's breathing got tighter, "Leave me alone." The group closed in just slightly, and then, "Tate." The word cut through everything. Tate was there at the edge of the courtyard, already walking in. He didn't run, he didn't look surprised, he just looked focused. His eyes locked onto Noah immediately, scanning him once then shifting to the group. "Step away," Tate said. The first boy scoffed, "Or what?" Tate stopped right in front of them, "Try it again." A tense silence followed. Noah shook his head slightly, "Tate, don't." But Tate didn't look at him, not yet. He only said, quieter now, "I said step away." The group hesitated. One of them muttered whatever and backed off first. The others followed, peeling away with annoyed laughs and sideways looks like they wanted to pretend it wasn't a retreat. When they were gone, the noise of the courtyard returned slowly. Noah let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. "You didn't have to do that again." Tate finally looked at him, "Yes, I did." Noah frowned, "It's not stopping them." Tate's expression stayed steady, "Then they're not listening yet." Noah stared at him, "That's not how this works." Tate stepped closer, voice lower, "It is for me." A pause. Noah's shoulders dropped slightly, "You're going to get yourself hurt." Tate shrugged once, "Then I'll handle it." Noah shook his head, "That's not the point." But Tate was already watching the hallway again, like he was waiting for it to happen a second time. By the time they were a little older, Tate had started getting attention in a way he didn't seem to notice, or didn't care to acknowledge. Girls at school would talk about him in passing conversations in the hallway at lunch tables. Not loudly, not directly, but enough that it was obvious. They'd laugh a little too much when he walked by, glance at him when they thought he wouldn't notice, and then immediately look away when he did. Tate never really reacted. Most of the time he didn't even register it because his attention wasn't there. It was always on Noah. Noah noticed it more than Tate did. The way people tried to get Tate's attention and failed. The way Tate would turn down invitations without even thinking, not because he was trying to be rude, but because he simply already had somewhere to be, usually next to Noah. One afternoon, a group of girls passed by their table while they were sitting together. One of them whispered just loud enough to be heard, "He's actually kind of perfect." Another giggled, "Yeah, but he's like, weirdly attached to Noah." Noah stiffened slightly but didn't look up. Tate, sitting beside him, didn't react at all. A moment later, one of the girls stopped near their table. "Hey, Tate, right?" Tate looked up, "Yeah." She smiled a little too brightly. "You're really good at basketball, we were watching last week." "Okay," Tate said, neutral. Another girl leaned in slightly. "Are you going to the game on Friday?" "No," Tate said immediately. The first girl blinked, "Why not?" Tate glanced briefly at Noah beside him, "Busy." That was it, no explanation, no hesitation. The girls lingered a second. clearly waiting for something else, some extension of attention, some opening, but it didn't come. Instead, Tate leaned slightly toward Noah, as if the conversation had already ended for him. Noah glanced at him. "You didn't even think about it." Tate frowned slightly. "About what?" "The game," Noah said. Tate shrugged. "I already have plans." Noah raised an eyebrow. "With me?" Tate nodded once. "Yeah." Noah let out a small breath through his nose, almost amused. "You realize people notice that, right?" Tate looked at him like that wasn't important. "I don't care." Noah shook his head slightly. "Of course you don't." A beat passed. Tate added, quieter but matter of fact, "You're the only one I actually listen to anyway." Noah went still for a second. "That's not normal," he muttered. Tate tilted his head. "It is for me." And just like that, the conversation ended in the same place it always did. Tate anchored firmly beside Noah, completely uninterested in anyone else trying to pull his attention away. Tate's fingers were laced tightly with Noah's as they walked down the hallway, like letting go wasn't even an option. A group of boys leaned against the lockers ahead, their voices already carrying. "Look who it is," one of them muttered, loud enough to land. "You two are going to hold hands all the way to class again." Noah's grip faltered just slightly. "Tate," he murmured under his breath. Tate didn't let go. If anything, his hold tightened. "Ignore them." Another boy laughed. "What, you his boyfriend or something?" Noah's face flushed. "We're just stop, okay?" "Just stop," the boy mocked. "Hear that? He doesn't even deny it." Tate stepped forward then, his voice low and steady. "Back off." That only seemed to amuse them more. "Or what?" one shot back. "You going to cry about it, or are you going to run and tell a teacher?" Noah tugged gently at Tate's hand. "Let's just go, please." Tate didn't move at first, his eyes fixed on them, jaw tight. For a moment it looked like he might actually do something, say something worse, escalate it. But then he glanced at Noah. The tension in Noah's face, the way his shoulders had drawn in like he was trying to make himself smaller. Tate exhaled sharply and turned away, still holding his hand. "Come on." They walked past, the laughter trailing after them. "Yeah, walk away," someone called. "Go cuddle or whatever you do." Noah stayed quiet until they were halfway down the hall. "You don't have to keep doing that," he said softly, eyes on the floor. "Holding my hand like that, it just makes it worse." Tate stopped. "What makes it worse," he said, voice tightening, "is them." "I know, but," Noah hesitated, "they're not going to stop. Tate and the teachers," he swallowed, "they hear it, they see it, and they don't do anything." Tate's grip shifted, his thumb brushing against Noah's knuckles. "I don't care what they think." Noah let out a small, shaky breath. "I do." That made Tate pause. "I don't like it," Noah continued quietly. "The way they look at me, the way they talk about us, it's like I'm doing something wrong just by standing next to you." "You're not," Tate said immediately. "I know that," Noah replied, though his voice wavered, "but it doesn't feel like it when it's all the time." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, slowly, Tate loosened his grip, but he didn't pull away completely. His hand stayed there, just barely holding onto Noah's. "I'm not letting go," Tate said under his breath. Noah glanced at him. "Tate." "I can try to make it less obvious," he admitted, though the words sounded forced, "but I'm not letting go of you." Noah looked down at their hands, still connected. After a long pause, he didn't pull away. In kindergarten, nap time was when it became most obvious. The classroom would quiet down after lunch, little mats laid out in neat rows, soft light filtering through the windows. Most of the children drifted off quickly, but Tate never settled unless Noah was right there. So he moved his mat every time, even when the teacher tried to correct it. Tate's teacher was having an issue with Tate again today due to his inability to sleep on his own mat. "Tate, your mat is right here," she would say, guiding him back gently at first. "You need to stay in your own space." But Tate would shake his head, already dragging his blanket closer to Noah's mat. "No." "Tate," the teacher repeated, firmer now, "that's not your spot." "I'm staying here," he insisted, dropping down beside Noah anyway, immediately curling in close like it was the only place that made sense. Noah didn't argue, he just shifted slightly to make room, used to it by now in a way the adults didn't fully understand. "Tate, come on," the teacher sighed, kneeling beside them. You can't keep doing this every day. When she reached for his arm to guide him back, Tate stiffened instantly. No, he said again, sharper this time. It's okay, Noah whispered quickly, glancing up at her. He just likes it like this. That's not the point, the teacher replied, patience thinning. He has to learn boundaries. She tried again to move him, more firmly this time, and Tate reacted on instinct, kicking out and catching her leg. It wasn't hard, but it was enough to make her recoil. Tate, she snapped, that is not acceptable. Tate immediately clung tighter to Noah, his small body rigid. Don't touch me. I was trying to help you, she said sharply, rubbing her leg. You don't kick adults, do you understand me? Noah sat up slightly, alarmed. Tate, it's okay, just let her. No, Tate interrupted, pressing closer to Noah like the world outside him didn't exist. I'm fine. You're not fine, the teacher said, exasperated now. You can't just cling to him like this all day. This is nap time, everyone has their own space. Tate didn't move. Instead, he shifted until he was fully wrapped around Noah, arms secured over his waist, refusing to loosen even an inch. After a few tense moments, the teacher stepped back, frustration clear but exhaustion winning out. Fine, but this is not going to keep happening. Once the room finally settled, the noise faded into soft breathing and rustling blankets. Tate's grip slowly loosened, not enough to let go, just enough for his body to stop fighting. Noah lay back down carefully, and after a moment Tate followed, still pressed against him. As sleep finally started to take him, Tate shifted again, gentler now, and settled so his head rested on Noah's chest. Noah went still for a second, then carefully placed his arm around him, as he understood without needing it explained. Tate's breathing slowed as he listened to Noah's heartbeat under his ear, steady and real. The tension that had been in his shoulders melted away inch by inch, like his body was finally convinced he was safe. Across the room, the teacher watched for a moment, then turned away with a tired sigh, choosing not to intervene again. And for that hour after lunch, Tate slept like that, curled into Noah, head on his chest, holding on as sleep itself depended on it. The next day, at nap time, Mrs. Johnson immediately noticed that something wasn't right. Tate hadn't moved his mat at all. Instead of dragging it across the carpet like he usually did, he had simply placed himself directly on Noah's, like the idea of separation hadn't even crossed his mind. He was already lying down, pressed close, arm wrapped around Noah's middle as if he'd decided in advance that this was how it would be. All right, Mrs. Johnson said sharply, walking over. Tate, up. Tate didn't open his eyes, he only tightened his hold slightly. No. This is not your mat, she said, pointing firmly to the empty space beside them. You know the rules, you stay in your own space. It is my space, Tate muttered like it was obvious. No, it's not, she replied, voice rising now. You cannot keep doing this, move. Noah shifted a little under Tate's weight, blinking up at the teacher. He just fell asleep like this again. He didn't just fall asleep like this, Mrs. Johnson said, frustration building. He made a choice. Tate, I'm not asking again, get up. Tate finally opened his eyes, but he didn't move. Instead, he pulled Noah closer, burying his face against Noah's chest like he was trying to disappear into the space there. No, he said again, quieter but firm. Mrs. Johnson exhaled sharply. Tate, this is getting out of hand. You cannot ignore instructions every single day. You have your own mat. I don't want it, Tate replied simply. That doesn't matter, she said, kneeling down to his level. You still follow the rules. Tate shook his head once. I'm staying here. Noah glanced between them, uneasy. Mrs. Johnson, it's okay, he's not hurting me. It's not about that, she interrupted. It's about boundaries and listening. She reached for Tate's shoulder to guide him up, and immediately his arms locked around Noah tighter. No, Tate said again, more urgent now. Don't move me. Tate, she warned, her patience breaking, let go and go back to your mat. No. Tate, I mean it. He buried his face deeper into Noah, holding on even more firmly now, his whole body tense like he was bracing for being pulled away. I'm not letting go, he said, muffled against Noah's chest. Mrs. Johnson stood up straight, her voice rising. This is exactly what I'm talking about. You cannot refuse every instruction just because you don't like it. Noah spoke again softly, trying to ease the moment. Maybe he can just stay a little closer today. That is not how this works, she snapped, then immediately sighed like she regretted the volume. Tate, listen to me, you are going back to your mat right now. Tate didn't respond. Instead, he clung tighter, arms locked, head pressed firmly into Noah as if the decision was already made and couldn't be undone. Mrs. Johnson pressed her fingers to her forehead. This is not negotiable. Tate didn't move at all, just held on to Noah like letting go would mean losing the only thing that made the room feel safe. Only time would tell whether Tate would take his teacher's words to heart or ignore them.